Well, in case nobody noticed, it's summer again. The solstice is past. We have these nice long lingering sunsets, and finally today some summer as opposed to equatorial weather. And summer is, of course, time when our sense of time slows down, and we begin going after our summer reading lists, right? And all that wonderful summer reading in the shade. Well, I always hesitate when people ask me that great conversational, reading any good books this summer? Because it's a conversation starter for most people, but I'm a college professor, and so it ends up being a conversation stopper. I mean, it stops conversation dead in its tracks. Because I'm reading all the time, but the books that I'm drawn to really won't make it to the New York Times bestseller list. So while everybody else has been reading 50 Shades of Grey, I've been curled up with the first volume of a Swiss Catholic theologian named Hans Urs von Balthasar's 7-volume work on theoaesthetics called The Glory of the Lord. And at that point, people sensing my enthusiasm for the book begin to back away, right? I don't blame them. Even worse than that, I'm slogging my way through. It's a short book. It's only 200 pages, but it's very long. I can only read about a page an hour. It's by an Oxford linguist named Ian Sainsbury, who is writing a 200-page analysis, very detailed, on just what proper nouns mean. Okay. Yeah, see what I'm talking about. In order to read that one halfway intelligently, I first had to review Bertrand Russell and John Stuart Mill and learn more than I ever wanted to learn about a 19th century German linguist named Gottlieb Frege and his linguistics. So I never talk about what I'm reading in polite social circles. But it looks as though I have a captive audience. So indulge me for a couple of minutes, if only to save yourself the trouble of reading these ghastly books yourselves, and go back to whatever it was you were reading. So one of the things I teach is the history of the English language, and I have a great interest as a teacher of literature in language and how it works. And my last couple of books have dealt with spirituality, language, the language of God, and that sort of thing. So I would like to start with one of the basic building blocks of language, the sound O. That's the title of my sermon today, O. And it is what's called a phoneme. It's one of 45 basic sounds in the English language, but it packs a lot of meaning if you think about it. For example, if you are overtaken by a sense of spontaneous wonder, like at the fireworks, you say, "Oh!" Right? And O can be part of an explicative phrase, as when you're hitting your thumb with a hammer and you say, "Oh!" Fill in the blank. You can use it as what's called a meaningless discourse particle. Oh, Bob, I've been meaning to speak to you. You can use it to express sensual pleasure. Oh. And if we do something wrong, we say, "Uh-oh." If we hear something that surprises us, we scratch our heads like the Higgs boson particle. Oh. And when we suddenly remember something we forgot when we walk out the door, "Oh!" Right? Or when something horrible happens to someone and we're sitting with them, we say, "Oh." And when we don't quite know what we want to say, we need what linguists call placeholder. And when we finally get it and understand something, we use what's called a back channel expression, say, "Oh, I understand." So I think most of the above meanings of O we could apply to the passage from Exodus that we just heard. Because even though it's not explicitly in the scripture, I am willing to bet that before Moses said anything else, when he saw the burning bush, he said, "Oh." Or better yet, he inhaled and said, "Oh." Like the sense of surprise, right? Or whatever its equivalent was in ancient, the Aramaic language that he spoke. In fact, I'll bet he said, "Oh," in a way that doesn't inform anybody. It doesn't ask a question. It doesn't give a command. In fact, it doesn't have any meaning at all in any conventional sense. It has no, what we'd call semantic content, whatsoever. It's simply a sound that expresses everything and nothing in a word that is both a word and not a word at the same time. So there was Moses, and I love the translation that I picked from the Jerusalem Bible, taking his flocks to the far side of the wilderness, not just the wilderness, but the far side of the wilderness, which is often where we encounter the divine. And he saw a bush which was burning without being burnt, and he said, "Oh," or "Oh," or "Oh." And then we know he was having an authentic religious experience. So I want to talk about "oh" moments, because many people end up here at this Fountain Street Church because in their past they've had trouble with religion and religions in their lives. What they're hearing about God in the churches they've attended does not speak to their experience of God or experience of the divine, but still they're looking for a way of talking about the experience of the divine that they may have had in their Moses-like "oh" moments. This basic religious impulse in human beings, if you remember Houston Smith when he was here, talked about it as a spiritual tropism, the way that a sunflower turns and orients itself to the sun with heliotropism. The human species has a spiritual tropism that seeks the divine somehow in many, many, many ways that we find in the world religions. And Otto Rank, the 20th century student of mythology, called that thing we experience the tremendous and fascinating mystery. And he described our encounter with it this way. He said, "The feeling of it may come at times like a sweeping gentle tide that pervades the mind with a tranquil mood of deepest worship. Or it may come, burst in a sudden eruption from the depths of the soul with spasms and convulsions. Or it may lead to the strangest excitements, to intoxicated frenzy, to transport, to ecstasy. It may become the hushed, trembling, speechless humility of the creature in the presence of that which is a mystery, inexpressible and above all creatures." So in those "oh" moments, we wake up, we come to consciousness in and of a universe that we did not ourselves create. And we experience it as a call, being called upon to think upon impossible things by another kind of intelligence, perhaps by the universe itself. And so we find characters in the Hebrew and the Christian scriptures suddenly and unexpectedly called by God, by name: Moses, Moses, Noah, Noah. Paul gets thrown from a horse, Paul. Samuel, young boy, wakes up in the middle of the night, Samuel, Samuel. Your name being called by the source of all creation. And whether the call comes in the form of a burning bush, or after being thrown from a horse, or when you're wakened in the middle of the night, we get the sense that human beings who can initiate a lot of thinking on their own, in these cases feel that they are called to think in a way that's not their own, in a sense. A kind of called thinking. It's the feeling Muhammad must have had listening to the angel Gabriel dictate the Quran. We feel we're being summoned by something that's in us because we're part of the universe, and yet at the same time outside of us. And it asks us, since it called our name, to find its name, to understand it. And this act of naming the caller, or finding the name of God, I believe is the first act of religion, and everything else follows from it. And it all begins with "oh," the "oh" of surprise, the "oh" of recognition, of coming to consciousness. And once the "oh" moment is past, the wordless word of our reaction, the hard work begins. Because after the "oh" moment, we begin to think, what in the heck was that all about? That moment of transport, that moment of ecstasy, our burning bush moment. And we try to give it a name, even though no name will be able to contain it, and that's the beginning of theology. Thinking about that which makes us say, "oh." There's a great line in the Upanishads. It says, "It's not the lightning that is Brahman, the source of being. It is that within the lightning which makes us say, 'oh.'" So, let's talk about my summer reading list. E.M. Sainsbury, the Oxford linguist, in his book Reference Without Referent, is trying to figure out what proper nouns mean. Now that sounds, don't wait for the movie on that one. But if I have an object I call a book, or a cup, a common noun, okay, you all pretty much know what I'm referring to, and you would recognize it if you saw it. But what about when I use a proper noun, like Mary, or John, or Cuthbert, a person's name? It's impossible to say what a Mary is, right? Because even if you're talking about the same Mary, when she was 5, she was both the same but quite different from when she's 35. So what does the word Mary mean? A cup doesn't change much over time, but a person does. So we call this person by the same label for their entire lives. What's that all about? And if there are 2 Marys in the room, you can't just say, oh, go see the Mary out there. And I'm looking at 200 people, and I can figure it's probably a woman, but other than that, I don't know what a Mary is, or a John for that matter. So unlike a book or a teacup, it's impossible to tell just what a Donald, or not the Donald, but a Donald, or a Henry, or a Suzanne is. And it gets more complicated when we consider proper names for which no person exists, like Sherlock Holmes or Jane Eyre, because there was never a real human being named Sherlock Holmes, and yet we know stuff about him as if he were real. We have images of him. But in fact, there never was what we call a referent for Sherlock Holmes. He's simply the sum total of all the words and movies and pictures and other things that we've read or seen about him, but he has no real existence. Which brings me, by an interesting turn in my thought, to the problem that's been obsessing me for the past few years, is what do we mean exactly when we say God? We're willing to kill each other for it. But what do we mean when we say God or Allah? Is the proper noun God like Sherlock Holmes? That is, God is no more than the sum total of words and images that human beings have used in all the religions of the world. Or is it more than that? And here we're beyond territory that even Sainsbury is willing to go into. We're on the far side of the linguistic universe. It's a great place to be. Great place to be. So this is called theolinguistics. A theologian, not a theologian, but a linguist at the Free University of Brussels named Jean-Pierre Van Noppen and I are corresponding back and forth a little bit. He's been working on this issue as well. Theolinguistics asks, what exactly are we naming when we say God? Those who maintain that religion is a bunch of hokum would say nothing. Yeah, God is just like Sherlock Holmes, now that you've mentioned it. The thing that we're naming, God, doesn't exist. A total fabrication of the human imagination that we create in our image out of our primitive superstitious desire for a Godfather in heaven to explain what we can't explain through human reason. So God has no more existence than Sherlock Holmes or Jane Eyre. It's a linguistic construct. Then at the other end of the theolinguistic spectrum, we have the true believers, the fundamentalists, who really know exactly what they mean when they say God.